Officially 11:01, so we will go ahead and officially start this webinar. Again, this is going to be a recorded webinar, so hopefully you're able to stay the whole time, but I know there's going to be some people watching this after the fact. There will be some points where I invite discussion in the chat. Obviously, if you're watching this recorded, you won't have this opportunity, but hopefully you're able to watch it in a group and get some of the participation aspects, because we do really want to kind of build relationships when we're thinking about compassion fatigue in the field. But I'll go ahead and get started. So I'm Dr. Megan LaFollette. I am program manager at the North American 3Rs Collaborative, and I have been leading for the past, it's actually only been about 6 months, our compassion fatigue resiliency initiative that has put together a program for your institutions to just start developing their own compassion fatigue initiatives and programs. We're giving lots of resources. We're conducting the longitudinal research. And yeah, today I'm going to just be presenting kind of an overview. And I titled it Caring for Our People, Caring for Our Animals, Introduction to Compassion Fatigue Resiliency. So let's start off big picture. The point of today's webinar is really to think about a broad overview of what we're even talking about when we're talking about compassion fatigue resiliency, and why are we so focused about this in our field particularly. So we all enter the research field for different reasons, but at the core, whether we're scientists, whether we're technicians, whether we're regulatory agents, etc., we want to help both people and animals. That's often our main goal. And that means that we're really driven in our careers and we really believe in what we're doing. But the bad side of this sometimes can mean that it can be difficult to separate our work and our life. Our lives are very intertwined with what we do day to day, and we care so much about our work. We also, of course, form bonds with the animals that we work with in the laboratory. And it doesn't matter whether they're rats, they're pigs, they're non-human primates. When we work with these animals day to day, we have these true relationships with them. But despite these bonds, despite this care, the reality of our field is that we often have to either perform or even just view stressful or painful procedures, housing conditions, etc., that are just part of the animal research, the important biomedical or basic research that we're doing. This can result in what's called perpetuation-induced traumatic stress. This is stress that results from actually causing a trauma to another being. And it's really unique, I think, to our field in that we are one of the only caring professions that cares for our animals, for our patients, as well as has the mandate to also sometimes cause some stress and harm to them in order to conduct research. And that can be really difficult to deal with. This is what I kind of term this caring harming paradox. And due to this, we can experience moral stress and emotional dissonance. Moral stress can occur when our internal morals don't match our external actions. And for an example of how this may work is I've worked in laboratory rat research. I've adopted pet rats, and I, maybe morally believe that rats deserve to be housed in very large cages with climbing opportunities, with digging opportunities, with human-animal interaction, with all of these things. And that's, my internal belief. That's how I think rats should be housed. But in the reality that is everyday research, they're housed in shoebox cages, and that's not something that is easily changed. There's good reasons for that. There may be, institutions trying to work away from that. And I accept that. That's okay. But there's this conflict internally between how I think maybe that things should be and how they are. And that can be really difficult. We also sometimes experience what's called emotional dissonance, where our internal emotions do not match the emotions we express. Again, I may feel some sort of, conflict about this, or I might feel sad about a procedure or frustrated about it, but I don't show it because I don't want to be labeled as animal rights. I'm afraid of what coworkers going to think about me. Maybe the culture just isn't really supportive, and so again, this can be really difficult. And it was 2018, I actually conducted a wide-scale survey of over 800 laboratory animal personnel, and we find that we see worse compassion fatigue when animals are receiving less enrichment, which I believe might be related to this moral stress. Again, most of us working in the field really, may want to have these bigger cages, may want to do more for our animals, but the reality is we might not be able to do that. And in the same vein, we see worse compassion fatigue when working with animal models that have an increased animal stress and pain. Again, we probably all have some sort of belief that we shouldn't harm animals. That's ideally what we want. But again, just part of the work that we do in order to study some models, we have to cause some of that. And we have to have valid models of these diseases. So that can be, this is very unique to our field and is a particular challenge that we experience. And of course, ultimately, most of our bonds with our laboratory animals are broken. Studies end in euthanasia. Sometimes there's adoption protocols, but that's not necessarily super common. And even if animals are adopted, we may not have contact with them again. And this is termed the caring killing paradox by Arluke in 1994. That's thought to be worse with stronger attachments and can also lead to what's called disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief occurs when society doesn't recognize the grief that we feel. So people might be like, oh, it's just a rat, it's just a mouse, it's just your job. And so we're not getting this support that, say, maybe a doctor might get if they had a patient die. We may not get organizational support, and we may even get some disrespect. And of course, some endings are going to be harder than others. We see worse compassion fatigue with physical methods. So decapitation, blunt force trauma, those are challenging. Even if they are, are okay for the animals, it can be hard for the people to do. And we see worse compassion fatigue if you don't have control over whether you are the ones to euthanize those animals. And we also see worse compassion fatigue with higher euthanasia distress. And we may not feel supported or valued by others in our work. We see worse compassion fatigue coming in when we have less social support and increased loneliness. Some feel that our field has dirty work connotations. This is all kind of tying in that we maybe don't feel supported by society. During the COVID-19 crisis, we were considered essential workers. People were going in every day, but we weren't getting the same recognition that many other essential workers were. And we may be working in long hours with understaffed workplaces. We know that that's a problem in the field right now. We see that in many institutions, that staffing and employment across lots of fields, but ours in particular, is very difficult. And we do see worse compassion fatigue with increased hours. And also, we might even be exposed to the stress of people caring for animals. In my work, I found that those working as trainers have worse compassion fatigue, which may be because they are with people during their first euthanasias, their first times doing these procedures that they may not be very difficult to. And it can be very difficult to see people going through those stress. There are also additional risk factors to recognize with compassion fatigue. Typically, you're going to be more at risk if you're younger, you have less job experience, poor mental physical health generally, you tolerate overwork, you have previous trauma, less self-care, and higher empathy. All of this can lead to workplace stress. And we know that this has negative effects in the human medical professional field, including increased depression, exhaustion, decreased relationship health, decreased patient satisfaction, quality of care, medical mistakes, increased staff turnover, and increased absenteeism. So this means that compassion fatigue is not just negative for people, but it's potentially negative for scientific quality, animal welfare, and the workplace as a whole. And I do want to take a step back. We're focusing on kind of the negative aspect of work, mostly in this talk, because that's what we are kind of setting up as the problem, as what we need to address. But really, professional quality of life has two components. It's not just compassion fatigue, but we also do have a great amount of compassion satisfaction that occurs in our field. Like I said earlier, with that meaningful work, a lot of us find a lot of meaning in what we do, a lot of value in what we do, and really leaning into this compassion satisfaction and feeling good about the work we do can be really beneficial. But then when we talk about compassion fatigue, there are generally thought to be two main components: burnout and secondary traumatic stress. And so burnout is really just, feeling tired, exhausted, frustrated with your work. And secondary traumatic stress is more similar to that PTSD component, where you might have invasive thoughts, nightmares, discomfort, etc. There's many different symptoms of compassion fatigue, so I'd like you to kind of think about if you're feeling any of these. I'm sure many of us probably are. Feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance from your job, negativism, cynicism, or hopelessness, reduced professional efficacy, difficulty with tasks, depression, anger, frustration, chronic physical ailments, isolation, sleeping, nightmares, etc. There's a lot of different symptoms that can occur with compassion fatigue. And I do want to mention that compassion fatigue can follow a trajectory. This is important to know, especially for the managers that may be listening to this talk, that sometimes people start in this field and they're just, so passionate. They're working, they're going above and beyond, they're doing all that they can. They're in this kind of zealot phase. And then they can kind of move to being more irritated, then withdrawing, and then just totally checking out. And so I mentioned this just because, especially when you are new in this field and when we have new employees come on, if they are giving so much to the institution, they are so passionate, don't just mark them off as, oh, they're okay, they don't need help. Even if you identify in this right now, sometimes I identify still in this kind of zealot phase, don't ignore this body of work and what you should be doing, because you can kind of go past that and go further. So how can we promote compassion fatigue resiliency? I'm going to pop out just to check the chat really quick because I only have one monitor today. Awesome. Okay, just wanted to check that. Okay, so what can we do? That's kind of setting up the background of what's going on in the field. I do want to make a disclaimer that NA3Rsc, we are not licensed mental health professionals or medical doctors. And so if you are experiencing symptoms, we always recommend seeing a therapist, counselor, psychiatrist, get the professional help we need. This is really meant to be kind of a broader overview. So the first thing that we really recommend that's supported by research is connecting with other people. And that's why today's talk is really structured with this 30 minutes of presentation and 30 minutes of discussion, because we really want to have people that we can really talk to about the challenges that we're facing. And often those that are actually in our workplace can be the best people for that, because certainly many of us have friends, have family. Hopefully they support the work that we do and we feel like we can talk to them. But unless they really work in the field, they may not really understand the challenges, the day-to-day stresses. And so trying to develop these workplace relationships, it's not just frivolous. It's not just, these chats that we have in the hallway. It's not just wasting time. It really is important for our institutional culture. Oh, so sorry. I forgot to reshare. Here we go. Can you guys see it now? Hopefully. Okay, so connecting with others. Sorry for that little blip. Um, but yeah, connecting with others is very, very important. And so we really encourage that. Of course, ensuring that you have a good foundation, sleep, nutrition, movement. I'm sure we've all heard this many times, but it just stands to say again that they are really critical for our mental health. Promoting self-regulation and relaxation skills is always good. So things like meditation, breath work, and mindfulness. Actually, and I'll mention this again at the end, our next talk is going to be entirely on mindfulness, because this practice is so important. Compassion fatigue and burnout is really related to having a stress disorder and our nervous systems just really amping up to what we're going through. And so we're going to be doing an entire webinar next month on mindfulness for everyday life. Self-care generally, so leaning into creativities, hobbies, having balance between your work and your life as much as possible, setting some boundaries if that's healthy for you, figuring out how you can have both is really important, and have some true time off. And then the last thing that I do want to mention, and I really find important, is being intentional with your self-talk. So the stories that we tell ourselves about our jobs, about the work that we do, really does matter. So there's this process that I recommend. So first, recognize what's going on. Recognize the situation. Again, just going back to my rat housing example, recognize that, yeah, maybe I really do wish that we had rats in this particular type of housing, and I'm feeling frustrated that I'm working in a facility that has very standard, very normal housing. Just recognize what's going on first, taking a step back. Then acknowledge what the reality is. Acknowledge what you can change, what you can't change. Just kind of taking a step back. And then finally, and I think most importantly, is trying to reframe and find positive meaning in your work. So maybe I don't love how the rats are housed right now, or the procedure that we're doing, or the euthanasia, or maybe there's something that I don't like. But maybe I can find positive meaning in the fact that I am the one doing that work, that maybe I can't do everything that I want for these animals, but I'm doing what I can, that I'm lobbying for them, that I am making sure our interactions are as positive as possible, that I am the one working with them. The more that you can find this value, this meaning in your work, the more positive that you're going to feel about it. And this self-talk really, really matters. And the more that this can be promoted both internally as well as externally can be really beneficial. Change what you can, obviously, but accept what you can, but move forward. Okay, so that's kind of the really broad overview of personal things. Like I said, we're going to be having more in-depth webinars on some of those. We're going to be providing resources on self-care, etc. But it is really important to take a step back and say that the responsibility for resiliency, for compassion fatigue resiliency, doesn't just lie on the individuals. It also lies on your institutions and the entire culture that is surrounding your workplace life, which is why the North American 3Rs Collaborative is partnering with each of your institutions to try to get compassion fatigue resiliency committees going, to get institutional resources for you, because it is not realistic and it is not fair to put all of the burden on the individual. So I think it's really important to put that disclaimer up there, as well as tell you all that your institutions all signed on with an agreement with the North American 3Rs Collaborative to work towards this. So they are, maybe they're not perfect now, maybe you have some frustrations now, but your institutions are working to make some of these changes. And I do want to mention too, related, that there's been kind of 6 main causes of burnout that have been identified that are really going to be important to try to work on at the larger institutional culture. So workload, of course, some of this, unfortunately, with staffing, with the work that we do, is really hard to manage, but the more that we can decrease workload, make it more manageable, the better. Perceived lack of control. So the more that we can give employees, people, the more that we can take control of our work, the better. Lack of reward or recognition. So we're going to be talking to institutions about, having award programs, recognition for people going above and beyond. I know several of your institutions already do this. Poor relationships. So our third webinar series is actually going to be called Creating Great Work Relationships, is going to be focused just on this relationship piece because it is so critical. Lack of fairness and values mismatch. So again, as part of this program, we're providing this Compassion Fatigue Resiliency Committee, as well as advice for managers in particular. So just so that you know that that's in the pipeline, but it'll be a kind of a slow rollout across the next 6 months or so. So, of course, we're going to be working, as I mentioned, with creating a Compassion Fatigue Resiliency Committee to take the lead. It is really important to have some people responsible for this, so it keeps moving forward. Institutional commitment to a culture of care is likely going to be good. And so I think our fourth webinar is going to be about culture of care and what we can do to promote it in our institutions. Training and continuing education, such as this talk today, kind of providing that overview. And promoting that workplace connection. So I'm going to be encouraging, again, particularly managers in meetings, but also everyone in the workplace to try to go beyond when you're talking to colleagues, the how are you, but also asking them, and we'll do this later during the discussion, but, can everyone go around and name a high and a low, so that we get a little bit more past the, well, I'm good, I'm fine, but actually identify what are people celebrating in their lives. And what are the challenges? And can we come together and help and both celebrate as well as look at those challenges? Supporting and modeling a workplace balance as much as possible in institutions is always going to be great. Ensuring euthanasia is communicated. So one of the recommendations that we're going to be making to committees is ensuring that people know that euthanasia is occurring before it happens, because it is such an impactful thing in our research lives. Provide and increase awareness of resources. We're developing some passive learning resources that you guys can look at. We have a website hub that maybe some of you have checked out in the past or will check out in the future to get help on your own. We also, many of you, maybe not all of you, may have participated in the survey that went out. That survey, we are going to be getting all the data collected. Like we said, it's all nothing personal, nothing private is going to be shared with any managers, but we are going to summarize that feedback, not taking any specific responses, and provide it to management so that they can see, what are my staff saying generally, what are the problems that come up, what can we look at that our institution in particular can improve on. So that's kind of the end of my just, again, really high level overview. But I did want to mention that next month's webinar for the Compassion Fatigue Resiliency Program is going to be on mindfulness for every day by Dr. Heather Hirsch. She's a psychologist who actually specializes in our field, which is really exciting. It's going to be on April 19th at 2 p.m. EST. This one is going to be an interactive webinar as well, but not group focused. So certainly it can still be watched as a group. We still encourage that if you can, but it's less critical than today's webinar. And everyone will receive an invitation to this sometime in the next couple weeks so that you can get it on your calendars. And of course, that webinar will also be recorded so that you can do it after the event. So at this point, I know that was kind of a really high level overview of compassion fatigue resiliency, but before we move into the discussion component, I wanted to invite if there's any questions about this program, compassion fatigue generally, etc. And I'll just wait a few minutes. Feel free to type them in the chat. There should be a little chat bubble at the top of your screens. If you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them. Okay, well, I don't see any questions, so that's great. So at this point, if anything comes up, feel free to type it in the chat. At this point, I'm going to move on to kind of the final part of our webinar today. Oh, awesome, I see one question. How does the notification of euthanasia apply in cases of species like mice? So it depends. So that's going to be up to each institution to decide. So I think I've typically seen some institutions will put a little heart sticker on animal cage cards that are going to be euthanized within the next couple days to a week. I think those are typically more used for animals that have a longer tenure, especially for large animals. So it would be really up to the institutions whether they would want to do that for mice, or if we feel like with mice, they're shorter stays, everybody who's working with them already knows. Again, that's going to be kind of up to the institutions to decide, but certainly it may be more challenging to institute with species that we have in very large numbers, such as mice. Other questions or comments? I'll wait a couple more minutes. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to this. Okay, great, sweet, another question. You may have mentioned it, but is there work showing less compassion fatigue in general in groups that use less physical methods of euthanasia? So the research that I have was that on an individual basis, so people who work in the field who report using more physical methods of euthanasia also report higher compassion fatigue. So it's not necessarily at the group level, it's at the institutional level. And also the data from that survey is across all institutions. So it does kind of filter out a lot of differences. It's just very high level. And then I had a question about, are all managers going to be required to see this presentation? So in a compassion fatigue resiliency program, we think it's really important that for the discussions, for everything, and we've told your managers this as well, that everything is voluntary for the kind of overview. However, we are going to, for managers in particular, we are going to be talking to your compassion fatigue resiliency committees about having specific training for managers and specific handouts for managers. And of course, and we are leaving that up to institutions. We are not mandating anything as the organizing nonprofit of this study, but we are strongly encouraging that all managers would watch this presentation, would read through the additional managerial guides for compassion fatigue resiliency, since obviously managers have a huge impact on how each employee experiences their day-to-day lives. So they're obviously very key players in an institutional compassion fatigue resiliency program. And so we're going to be talking to, or we are talking to the committees, and they've received a starter pack that kind of addresses some of this. Other questions? I'll wait 1 or 2 more minutes. Okay, so at this point, we're going to kind of move into this guided discussion part of the webinar. Can anyone chime in on the chat? Is anybody in person with others in their group right now watching this live? Awesome, cool. See, med sci group. Great. Okay, so So that was my hope, was that at least some people would be able to be in person in groups watching this. And so we're going to move to a portion of the presentation that's going to be a little bit strange because we both have the in-person groups and the virtual groups. But my recommendation is that if you're in person, that these types of discussions would happen in groups of about 4 to 5 people. And I've sent everybody who signed up for this webinar a discussion guide to kind of walk you through this. But because I know that due to COVID, due to other restrictions, that not everyone is able to do this, I'm also going to be facilitating some discussion online. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop up some slides that are going to kind of do a short introduction. And if you're doing this in person, my recommendation is that once I go through this introduction, you potentially mute the presentation to the end, and I'll pop up the slides when I recommend that you move to different components. So that's how that's going to work. So I'm going to pop back into my slides, although I'm going to leave them in this format just so that it's a little bit easier for me to see the chat. Okay. So for the discussion component, it's important whether you're in person or virtual that we establish some ground rules. So everyone should really participate in this discussion. Again, we're not forcing anyone. If you're really not comfortable sharing anything, you don't have to, but you're not going to get the same benefits if you don't participate. And so we really want you to respond to these questions, whether you're in person or virtually. Just choose one or the other. There's also no right or wrong answers. Say what you think, say what you feel, that's okay. The third ground rule is what's said in the discussion stays in the discussion. Again, virtually, this part of this recording is not going to be shared. And obviously other people virtually are going to be able to do it. We're kind of limited on that. But ideally, nothing said in this discussion today should be shared past this webinar or past these groups. And then just let's make sure, especially if you're in person today, that you are listening to others. So that's kind of the ground rules.